The roots of Tuscarora activism. The Tuscarora, hemp gatherers, or shirt-wearing people, are a Native American tribe and First Nations band government of the Iroquoian language family, with members today in North Carolina, New York, and Canada. They are coalesced as a people around the Great Lakes, likely about the same time as the rise of the Five Nations of the historic Iroquois Confederacy, also Iroquoian-speaking, and base them in present-day New York. Well before the arrival of Europeans in North America, the Tuscarora had migrated south and settled in the region now known as Eastern Carolina. The most numerous indigenous people in the area, they lived along the Roanoke, Neuse, Tar, and Pamlico rivers. They first encountered European explorers and settlers in the colonies of North Carolina and Virginia. After the 18th century wars of 1711 through 1713, the Tuscarora Wars, against English colonists and their Indian allies, most of the surviving Tuscarora left North Carolina and migrated north to Pennsylvania and New York. Over a period of 90 years, they aligned with the Iroquois in New York because of their ancestral linguistic and cultural connections. Sponsored by the Oneida, they were accepted in 1722 as the sixth nation of the Iroquois. After the American Revolution, in which they and the Oneida allied with the colonists, the Tuscarora shared reservation land with the Oneida before gaining their own. The Tuscarora Nation of New York is federally recognized. Those Tuscarora who allied with the British in the American Revolution resettled with other Iroquois tribes in present-day Ontario, where they are part of the Six Nations of the Grand River First Nation. Only the tribes in New York and Ontario have been recognized officially by the respective national governments. After the migration was completed in the early 18th century, the Tuscarora in New York no longer considered those remaining in North Carolina as members of the tribal nation. Since the late 20th century, some North Carolina remnants have formed bands in which they identify as Tuscarora. As of 2010, several bands in Robeson County have united on the interim basis as the Tuscarora Nation One Fire Council. The Tuscarora, although a part of the Iroquois Confederacy, were never given equal status with the other five nations. They were able to present at Chiefs General Council of the Iroquois Confederacy meetings, but had to ask permission to address council representatives. The majority of Tuscarora people are Protestant Christians. The Tuscarora Longhouse was actually burned down in the 1840s. The other five nations of the Iroquois, although also having Christian factions, have deeper connections to their traditional spiritual beliefs and were influenced by the great leader and prophet Handsome Lake of 1735 through 1815, who led a traditional revival among the Haudenosaunee, people of the Longhouse. Thus, traditional Tuscarora people, like Mad Bear, were the underdog among the greater Confederacy, and for this reason, they may have had extra incentive to prove their worth as spiritual and political leaders. There is no question now that their political activism puts the Tuscarora on equal footing with the other Six Nation traditional counterparts. Today, Tuscarora is one of the four Haudenosaunee communities in the United States that still operates under their original form of traditional governance, via chiefs and clan mothers, despite previous attempts by the Federal Indian Reorganization Act of 1935 to institute elected tribal government. At the Tuscarora Reservation, the Chiefs Council is made up of 13 chiefs from 7 clans. The people also hold a General Council that represents the 457 members of the reservation. The Iroquois reservations in New York, among them the Tuscarora Reservation, do not have their land held in trust by the United States. The Iroquois have ownership over their own land in the U.S. Tuscarora Trail of Tears. The Tuscarora people had their own Trail of Tears story, set apart from that of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, Creek, and Seminole. Had faced between 1830 and 1850. The Tuscarora Trail of Tears certainly justifies the feelings of anger and resentment that the Tuscarora must have towards the past actions of the U.S. government. Mad Bear talked about the Tuscarora Trail of Tears in a 1967 radio interview with WBFO. Here is his account, briefly summarized. In 1838, the U.S. government presented the Tuscaroras with a plan to relocate to Kansas, where a supposed plot of abundant land, filled with game, rivers overrun with fish, and a large forest was purchased for them. The Tuscarora were also told that lumber was already cut, implements for farming were in place, and homes were constructed for them to occupy. The U.S. government asked in exchange for the title to Tuscarora lands in Lewiston, New York. Only 550 Tuscaroras accepted the deal and left the Tuscarora reservation, heading for Kansas in the dead of winter. These individuals found themselves being prodded by the bayonets of U.S. soldiers and agents as they marched westward. Most of these Tuscarora died en route, due to the harsh weather and lack of proper nutrition and medical aid. When the remaining 50 Tuscaroras reached the river bordering Kansas, the U.S. agents told them that there were 3 wagons loaded of gifts that would shortly be delivered to them on the other side of the river. The first person to reach these wagons would have their choice of the most beautiful blankets, pots and pans, trinkets, whiskey, and etc. The Tuscarora crossed the river, and the 3 wagon loads came. They noticed something very strange. The yokes on the oxen pulling the wagons were very lengthy. Some were 20 feet long. Why so long? They quickly lost their curiosity and ran toward the wagons to receive their gifts, but were startled by the sound of gunshots. The U.S. soldiers, from a distance, shot and killed the oxen. These oxen appeared to be strong and healthy-looking. The Tuscarora were perplexed by the strange behavior of the U.S. soldiers. The Tuscarora quickly shifted their attention onto the wagons, which did indeed contain beautiful colorful blankets and miscellaneous items. Not long after, they quickly realized that they had been tricked. The U.S. soldiers and agents retreated, and they were left on a barren piece of land, which resembled nothing that they had been promised. No houses, little game, no cut lumber, and no implements for farming. They had been tricked. A few days later, the Tuscaroras began to get sick from the smallpox, and 45 of them died immediately. The U.S. Army, turns out, provided the Tuscarora beautiful blankets that were contaminated with smallpox. This was germ warfare. The 5 survivors left Kansas and made it back to the Tuscarora reservation in New York. These 5 survivors ended up infecting the reservation, and 2/3 of the Tuscarora died from disease. The Tuscarora Nation faced extermination with only 200 survivors. Today, around 1,152 Tuscarora live on the reservation, so fortunately, the nation was able to rebound and recover from the atrocities committed against them. This story that Mad Bear told is an oral example and testimony of germ warfare practices that the U.S. Army allegedly used against the American Indians. Debates exist whether the U.S. and the French and British armed forces actually used smallpox as a weapon against the Indians. As of yet, there is no scientific evidence of this germ warfare occurring at this time. However, the intention was certainly documented in the 1763 letters by British General Amherst and Colonel Bouquet, mentioning spreading smallpox to the Indians during the Pontiac War. There is no denying that the U.S. government in later years covertly used germs and other chemical agents on targeted U.S. citizens for purposes of human experimentation. A prime example is the admitted Tuskegee syphilis experiment, 1932 through 1972, by the U.S. Public Health Services on African Americans. Another example are the 1977 Senate hearings on health and scientific research that confirmed 239 populated areas in the United States had been contaminated with biological agents between 1949 and 1969. Some of the areas included San Francisco, Washington, D.C., Key West, Panama City, Minneapolis, and St. Louis. Chief Clinton Rickard. Tuscarora modern political activism started in 1926 with the founding of the Indian Defense League, which later grew beyond the Six Nations, becoming the Indian Defense League of America, IDLA. This organization was founded by Chief Clinton Rickard, 1882 to 1971, along with Chief David Hill, Mohawk, and Sophie Martin. The League was created to promote unrestricted travel across the international border between the United States and Canada. Chief Clinton Rickard was an adamant proponent of Indian nations' sovereignty. He believed that each Indian nation were separate national entities and not under the jurisdiction of the U.S. and Canada. He believed that all Six Nations Indians had citizenship within their own nation. The Indian Defense League defended Six Nations border rights that were guaranteed to them by the Jay Treaty, Article 3, and the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. In 1795, the United States and Great Britain created the Jay Treaty to avoid going to war with each other. Wikipedia stated that this resolved issues remaining since the Treaty of Paris, 1783, which ended the American Revolutionary War, and also facilitated 10 years of peaceful trade between the United States and Britain in the midst of the French Revolutionary Wars that began in 1792. On September 17, 1923, the Canadian government, Order in Council, moved to dissolve the traditional Iroquois government and did not recognize the Jay Treaty. The Canadian Indian Office also attempted to force Canadian citizenship. Similarly, the United States government created the Citizen Act of 1924, making all American Indians citizens of the U.S. This led Chief Clinton Rickard to ask the question, how can you be a sovereign nation and be forced to become a citizen in a foreign government? This imposed move towards citizenship was rejected by the Haudenosaunee people. To further add fuel to the fire, the U.S. Exclusionary Immigration Act of 1924 made Six Nations border crossings problematic between the U.S. and Canada. In 1928, this Immigration Act was overturned as a result of Chief Rickard and others from the Six Nations' tireless fight against it. According to the United States, the Six Nations people were free to travel across the borders uninterrupted. On July 14, 1928, the annual boarding crossing celebration was birthed, which still continues today. Further border complications did occur on the Canadian side, however, so the struggle of Iroquois sovereignty regarding their border meant that the IDLA had to be vigilant in their defense of their treaty rights. In June 1955, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the residents on the Canadian side of Akwesasne, Mohawk Nation territory, had to pay duties on goods purchased in the U.S., despite their claim of exemption under the Jay Treaty of 1794. It was not until 1969 that the Canadian government recognized the Haudenosaunee Treaty rights and fully allowed Six Nation citizens to cross the border freely without paying duties on U.S. goods. The persecution of Six Nations people at their border brought forth resistance and a renewed solidarity from Indians scattered along the international border. This was the beginning of intertribal unity within the Six Nations itself. This unification also embodied the IDLA, led by Chief Rickard, to lead further resistance movements like the fight against the imposition of the Selective Service Act Nationality Act of 1940 on Indian men. It is uncertain whether Mad Bear was a member of the IDLA, but we do know that he spoke at their dinner meeting on November 9, 1958, along with General Herbert Holdridge. Mad Bear certainly admired the political leadership of Chief Rickard, who surely inspired future leaders like Mad Bear to surge ahead forward the struggle of Indian sovereignty. The IDLA, in its heyday, also lobbied against the Indian Reorganization Act, the Wheeler-Howard Act of 1934, and other assimilation schemes hatched in Washington, D.C. and Ottawa. The Indian Reorganization Act, IRA, of June 18, 1934, was U.S. federal legislation that dealt with the status of Native Americans. The stated goal of this Indian New Deal was supposed to reverse the traditional goal of assimilation of Indians into American society, and to strengthen, encourage, and perpetuate the tribes and their historic traditions and culture. The IRA was the most significant initiative of John Collier, BIA Commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs from 1933 to 1945. He had crusaded on Indian issues in the 1920s, particularly with the Indian Defense Association. To many tribal leaders, like Clinton Rickard, the IRA was known as the Indian Raw Deal. Those opposed to the act feared that it would be detrimental to their tribes because it would be controlled by the federal government and wouldn't respect their nation's sovereignty. In the 1940s, during World War II, the IDLA protested against the military draft for Native Americans. In 1948, they visited the United Nations headquarters in New York City, dressed in feathered headdresses and beaded buckskin jackets. They petitioned for membership into the international body, and they wanted global participants to put pressure on the U.S. and Canada to stop their treaty violation with the Native Americans. Chief Tuscarora. The actual roots of modern Tuscarora activism trace back to Chief Tuscarora of the Cayuga, who brought Iroquois Six Nations concerns to the League of Nations, the international stage, forerunner to the United Nations in the early 20s. The Six Nations in Canada faced two levels of colonial administration in the early 1920s because although Canada had its own Confederation government since 1867, its military and foreign policy were controlled by the British until 1949. Although some Grand River Indians wanted to become Canadian citizens, others were loyal to Britain. It was in this context that Levi General, aka Tuscarora, worked to fight for his nation's concerns. Tuscarora, who became a Cayuga hereditary chief in 1917, traveled to London in August 1921 with Attorney General P. Decker, who was hired by the Six Nations as counsel. Because the Canadian government would have denied him permission to travel, the Six Nations Confederacy issued their own passport for Tuscarora at the advice of Decker. Tuscarora distributed a pamphlet entitled Petition and Case of the Six Nations of the Grand River. Winston Churchill, British Under-Secretary for the Colonies at the time, stated the petition should be returned to the Canadian government, so Decker and Tuscarora returned to the United States. In 1922, the two men went to Washington, D.C. and gained the support of the Netherlands Minister of Foreign Affairs, H.A. von Carnebeck, who sent their petition to the League of Nations Secretaries General's office. They also gained the support of the Swiss Bureau International. On July 14, 1923, Tuscarora and Decker sailed to Geneva, Switzerland. Decker returned to the U.S. after a brief time but communicated with Tuscarora frequently by mail. Meanwhile, Tuscarora remained in Switzerland for 18 months, lecturing before large audiences in Geneva, Bern, Lausanne, Lucerne, Winterthur, and Zurich. He reminded European colonizers of the New World of their obligations under the two-row wampum. The most significant pact made between the Iroquois and the Europeans. His eloquence, persistence, and ability to speak French helped win the support of some nations, including Ireland, Panama, Persia, and Estonia. Modern historian Lawrence Hauptmann wrote that, while Tuscarora's lectures generated a warm reception by the Swiss people, they were not effective in changing British or Canadian positions. On September 17, 1924, Governor-General Julian Byng, 1st Viscount Byng of Vinmy, mandated the Six Nations Confederacy Council at Schwegen be replaced with an elected council as described by Canadians' Indian Act. On October 7th, the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, dissolved the traditional government of the Six Nations, stealing important documents and wampums, and declaring an immediate election to displace the traditional government. Although Tuscarora became even more outspoken as a result of these events, even writing King George V directly, he was unable to make headway and was never able to meet his original goal of speaking to the League of Nations. Although he left a copy of a proclamation at their offices in Geneva before he left on January 3, 1925. Tuscarora, who was not permitted entry back into Canada, was staying at the home of Chief Clinton Rickard on the Tuscarora Reservation during the final months of pneumonia that followed a bad cold he had contracted in Europe. He requested the aid of a traditional medicine man from the Six Nations Reserve in Canada, but the medicine man was not allowed to cross the border. The U.S. had just passed the Immigration Law of 1924, which denied entry to anyone who did not speak English. On his deathbed, Tuscarora told Rickard to fight for the line. Chief Rickard did. He created the Indian Defense League in 1925, the right of free passage for Aboriginal people. Chief Tuscarora passed the torch, fight for the line, to Chief Rickard. Later on, this torch was passed to Mad Bear, who again brought Haudenosaunee concerns back to the international stage. Hence the roots of Tuscarora political activism.